So here we are looking at part 3 of the second half of the Chinese Civil War. This portion is going to examine the nature of the war from 1946 to 49. World War II has ended, and the war between the communists and the GMD shall resume, and this is what we talk about in this section.
In the victory celebrations, Chiang was the hero of China. But the quick end of the war left an important question unresolved. Who would take the Japanese surrender in North China? The communists raced to get their armies north. Nationalist troops were airlifted by America to arrive first. General Lu Jingzhao remembers what Mao said about Chiang Kaishek.
He wants to come down the mountain to harvest peaches. That's what Mao said. Our people and our army had made great sacrifices behind the Japanese lines. So we wanted to take the surrender in those areas. I rode all night back to the front. You couldn't say we were harvesting peaches, but we did want to taste a few.
Civil war seemed inevitable. Patrick Hurley, now U.S. ambassador in China, persuaded Mao to go to Chongqing for talks with Chiang. The two men had not met in nearly 20 years, since the days of Sun Yat-sen in Canton. Chiang addressed Mao as elder brother, and Mao made the toast, "Long live Chiang Kaishek."
And here we have a handy-dandy map of what China looked like at the end of World War II. So if you can see that the hot pink areas were areas of Japanese occupation, and then the stripy areas are the areas of CCP occupation. And one of the things that you should be able to see from this is that the CCP made sure to establish themselves in areas where the Japanese were located as well. Basically, they were very much involved in fighting the Japanese occupation. At the end of World War II, the U.S. is pretty much the major foreign actor in the Pacific region. And so the U.S. has essentially taken control of Japan, occupies Japan, and is supposed to be restabilizing the region, and so on and so forth. And toward that goal of stabilization, at the end of the war, the U.S. sort of brokered a truce between the GMD and the CCP. You and I know that it was not going to last, and it didn't. In March of 1946, that truce breaks down, and fighting begins in Manchuria. Now, the CCP was in a better position in Manchuria because Manchuria had been largely liberated by the Russians. And the Russians held back all of the weapons and such that they had taken from the Japanese and gave them to the CCP. So the CCP now begins this portion of the war better equipped than they had been previously. And so what we have from 46 to 47 is the battle for Manchuria. And keep in mind that Manchuria is a plum. Manchuria, it has massive amounts of natural resources, and which is why the Japanese invaded in the first place. So this is actually a place that they all want to control. The strategy that the CCP used was to actually fall back. And the GMD is moving farther and farther from its home bases. And so now they're spread very thin and they become overextended. So the CCP withdrew from Yan'an. Remember, Yan'an is where they set up their stronghold after the Long March, and they let the GMD capture it. And so the GMD now is moving, trying to fight from city to city. And they're trying to get a hold of the cities. And that means that there are huge chunks of countryside that the GMD is not even trying to control. And this is going to be their undoing. And the CCP, they ordered no fighting unless they were certain of victory. So continually forcing the GMD to splay out, but frustrating them as well. Ultimately, the GMD is stretched out very thinly across Manchuria. And if you remember from the previous map, there's a nice chunk of central China that is under largely CCP control. So they are stretched out. They're far from their base of power. And and between essentially the outposts of the militaries, that is between the cities, the countryside is essentially controlled by the CCP, the People's Liberation Army. And they also disrupted GMD communication. Ultimately, the CCP is going to win the Battle of Manchuria. And looking at this map, you can see the Chiang Kaishek strategy in 1947. So the blue arrows represent the GMD, and the red would be the CCP. So the GMD is trying to pinch the CCP in, but the CCP is attacking in a couple of different ways. In land that they control and that they have the hometown advantage. The battle for Manchuria continues until 1948, and Lin Biao launches an offensive in Manchuria, capturing the railways. So now the CCP also have control of the transportation. So now the GMD is limited in terms of being able to send more troops in terms of being able to send food and weapons and munitions to their soldiers. Eventually, the GMD soldiers, they see the writing is on the wall. 1 million, that is such a ginormous and almost unfathomable number. 1 million GMD soldiers surrender, and they switch sides and join the People's Liberation Army instead. And so this basically means that GMD is going to lose Manchuria, and this means that the GMD loses the best fighting forces. So Chiang Kaishek had thrown her best at this in Manchuria, kind of as this, we have to stamp out the CCP. And with that much loss, the GMD loses the best equipped as well as the best trained. And so now the offensives in September and November of 1948, you have 3 commanders of the CCP moving eastward, and then there's a 4th commander moving in northern and Manchuria area. And then you see the GMD commanders where they're stationed. And essentially you see how they're cut off from each other and more vulnerable. So 1948 to 49 saw 3 decisive battles. We have the climax of the Manchurian campaign between October and November 1948. The battle for Tianjin and Beijing in January 49, the Huaihai campaign in December over the winter of 48-49. Altogether, with these 3 battles, the GMD loses 1.5 million fighters, and there's no hope. Chiang Kai-shek steps down from the presidency of the republic. Another handy-dandy map. Basically, you see the Chinese offensives, November 48 to January 1949, and the GMD forces are encircled by the various CCP generals, and they essentially have no chance. And then again, this is now April through October 1949. Once they finish capturing Manchuria, they head down to the more central areas, and they capture like Beijing, the capital, and stuff like this. And now that they have done that, they now push south and push the GMD out. And what you can see, those blue arrows in the southeast corner, that is the GMD fleeing to Taiwan.
But American aid could not win the war for Chiang. He made the crucial mistake of overextending his forces in the north. The communists responded with a change in tactics. They mounted a major offensive against the nationalist armies in the cities. The change of tactics worked. By November 1948, after only a month and a half, the communists won control of North China.
Nationalist troops were crossing over to us in divisions and armies. When we first got to the Northeast, we had 100,000 troops. Now we were 400,000 or 500,000 strong.
Our equipment all came from the United States and Chiang Kaishek. There was a joke among the soldiers. They said that Chiang was our best supplier of American weapons. That was the joke. They said that after we win, we'll give him a medal that weighs a ton. Because he did such a good job for us.
With North China under communist control, the battle for central China began. Huang Wei led Chiang Kai-shek's crack 12th Army.
Our movements were slow. Our equipment was heavy, cumbersome. We were fighting, retreating, and bringing up reinforcements simultaneously. Our formations were beaten back bit by bit. We would be wiped out in 1 day, 2 days' time. So I gave the order to flee. That saved some people. On December 15th, we broke out in several places. My deputy commander and I got into a tank and fled. We fled to a place about 15 miles from Chuangduiji. That evening, the evening of December 15th, the tank I was in broke down, couldn't move. So we got out and fled on foot. The communists were everywhere. And they caught me. I became their prisoner.
On October 1, 1949, Mao declares the People's Republic of China. All right, so let's take another look at foreign involvement. So the videos you've been watching have provided information about foreign involvement. I hope you've been taking note of that. But ultimately, one of the things to consider here is that the U.S. Starts providing more limited support for the GMD as the war wages on. A few reasons for that. One, because the U.S. was really desirous of peace between the two. And so I guess the idea was that if you place them on more equal footing, then they will realize that it will be a Pyrrhic victory, and they will sit down and come to terms and maybe establish a sort of like multi-party state that they can both participate in. But that is not the outlook of either party. And also, I don't think the U.S. fully understood the dynamic of what was happening in China and just China itself, and basically the outlooks of the two groups. Another reason why the U.S. Wanted peace is the U.S. was already heavily bogged down in Japan. And keep in mind, this is the same time that the U.S. is putting into place the Marshall Plan and spending a huge amount of money trying to rebuild Europe, spending a lot of money trying to rebuild Japan and other places in Asia. And there was a limit to the well, obviously, and there's also a limit to how much the U.S. population was willing to keep doing this. And so the U.S. was trying to figure out ways to extract herself as much as possible. And to that end, there was the attempt to broker the peace. And then, of course, the aid starts being restricted because of the high levels of corruption which have been presented